Well, thank you, Brooklyn. And thanks everybody for being here. I don't know if expert is a good term, but I am a practical practitioner. And so hopefully some of my lessons learned, both with worms, but composting in general, can help you make more informed decisions. Um, there's a lot of things on the market, both from just straight raw compost that we can buy in bulk. And then there's all sorts of materials, manufactured methods, and things like that to try to do composting, but really composting decomposition is a natural process that's going to happen whether we're there or not. And so a lot of folks with their life and schedules and things like that, about the best they could practically manage is probably an organic trash heap, as I like to call them. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. But what we're going to talk about today is the practice of composting, which is, we are composting to either get something decomposed that's usable faster or of a better quality than maybe just letting a organic trash heap sit. So the back end of this, and I'll show you my system here with worms, but I think it's important to explain more traditional forms of composting so we can better understand the differences and if some of these other methods are going to better suit both our life but then also our tools and resources that we have available to us. Because to me, composting should not cost us really much money or any money. And there's a lot of things on the market that really do cost quite a bit of money, and I don't know if that's always necessary. So let me make sure I can move to the next slide. So I find with a lot of gardeners is we have a misunderstanding of what compost really is. I don't know how many school gardens, raised bed gardeners I've heard from over the years where they have said, we just had a disappointing year in our raised bed, especially it's usually people with raised beds. And I say, well, what did your fertility program look like? And the answer sometimes is, well, we added a bag of black cow at the beginning of the season. So compost is not necessarily a fertilizer replacement or really that rich in nutrients. Think of compost as a soil conditioner, a soil amendment that works to improve both sandy soils and clay soils. That's the really nice thing about it, is it goes a long way in a clay soil, which is what we deal with mostly up here in Cherokee. In Pike County, it probably is still some clay, but there may be sandy areas. So compost is going to make that a lighter soil. In the case of clay soils, it's going to help to improve drainage or tilth, the structure of that clay soil. In a sandy situation, it's going to help to add some water retention capabilities. So it's going to go a long way in both soil types. For me, as a homeowner, we grow a lot of fruit here at the house. We eat a lot of smoothies and cook. So I view it as a way of just recycling those materials that don't necessarily need to end up in the landfill. And I also like to look at it as, wow, this is nutrients, carbon, organic matter that grew somewhere else on Earth in some cases. In the case of our banana peels or our avocados, those may be from thousands of miles away. And now I can build my on-farm or on-garden nutrient cycles by sunlight and nutrients that came from somewhere else. So again, think of compost more as a way to improve structure, improve the biological activity in our soil, which is associated with plant health, nutrient uptake, but isn't necessarily one-for-one fertilizer equivalent. So as I sort of talked about in the structure case, this is not a picture from this year on the left side, but this is what a clay soil is going to look like when we get really dry weather. It's going to crust. And the challenge there is once we get crusting, we can maybe have a short pop-up rain shower or even a pretty good rain shower. And because of that crusting that's going to happen, a lot of that water is not going to actually infiltrate into the soil. It's going to form almost like a terracotta pot type effect on the outside. That water is going to bead off and look for somewhere more on the right side where you're going to have aggregates. You're going to have better water pathways down into the root zone. So again, improving the tilth, the structure of the soil with compost, with organic matter, is going to also just help with water infiltration, water uptake in our plants, and things like that. So we want a soil, hopefully, that looks a little bit more like the soil on the right. These numbers have probably changed, but we can, if we have the right tools, and if we really want to commit to composting in our yard or on our property, we can offset some considerable costs. So it's pretty good to factor compost usage in, say, a vegetable garden. If we're going to start a new garden out of what was otherwise maybe turf or unused property, about 2 to 3 inches of compost over the whole area, then tilled in, is probably what we would do best to sort of budget for. So that can get fairly expensive if we're starting out a new, couple 1,000-square-foot garden or something, or even filling a raised bed. Some of these raised beds, depending on how deep we build them, may take a whole yard. Hopefully you're not filling them with straight compost. Hopefully it's more of a blend of topsoil and compost in that type situation. So, but how does all this work? Quite simply, we have browns, which are associated with the carbon. So if we measure something as a brown versus a green, they're all organic materials. It's just on that carbon to nitrogen ratio. So we'll always probably have more carbon than we do nitrogen. It's just if it hits, say, 40-1 or lower, then it's going to be classified as a green. If it's higher than that, above, say, 40-1, then we're looking at something that's categorized more as a brown, more carbon. So it's not really about the color, because coffee grounds are brown. They are very much more of a technical green, a nitrogen source. If we have these proportions right, with moisture, with air, the power is in the biology here. It's just a matter of time on how quickly that material is going to be converted, transitioned over into more of a soft, humus-like finished compost. And this is where some of the materials that are on the market, like tumblers and bins and things like that, all they really do is allow for this process to maybe happen a little bit faster, because that aeration, that turning, that speeds it up. It gets more air circulating through the system. These bacteria are respiring. So the more oxygen they can have when they need it, the faster they do this conversion process. So it's important to remember, both in a worm bin and outside in a tumbler or in a bin or in a pile, we want moisture to be at about 40% is ideal. And that would feel like, to touch, about like a wrung out sponge or a dish towel after we've wrung it out. That amount of moisture is what we would want in that pile, tumbler, or even your worm bin. So how all of this happens, and this happens in the worm bin as well, is we have bacteria in a, what does this say here? Tablespoon of compost. We have hundreds of millions of bacteria. These are single cell organisms, and they are the powerhouse in your compost bin. They are doing the actual work. They are generating the heat as well, which is critical to understand. And then later on, the more complex breaking down of harder carbon, things like wood chips, pine cones, things like that. That's where the fungi become more involved. And that usually takes a little more time. So if we want to ever speed up the breaking down of compost, speed up this from start to finish process, the more surface area, the smaller the material that we have, the faster it's going to break down, because that's more area that bacteria can colonize and do this conversion process. So similar to what we looked at there, but you have a lot of biology in just a teaspoon of compost. And again, that's one of the biggest, if not the biggest benefit of then using compost in your gardens, in your landscape, and things like that, is we are then introducing or providing additional biology in our soil that do help to encourage or increase nutrient uptake and things like that. So like I talked about, the bacteria, these are our powerhouse in our composting system, even in our worm bin. About 80 to 90% of the biology in compost is bacteria. Single cell organisms that move and live on films of water. So again, this is why moisture management is so important, because if that environment ever becomes too wet or too dry, they're just not going to replicate. They're not going to survive. Too wet, that pile or that system is going to become anaerobic, and it's probably going to start smelling very bad quite quickly. We classify these bacteria by the temperature stages that they thrive at and reproduce at. So, and this is where it can be challenging for kind of the backyard gardener or the homeowner, is for composting to be most efficient. It is done best when we can make a batch, an entire pile or a batch all at once, because then we have the critical mass needed, and that's usually about a yard. It's almost 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet tall, a batch forming all at once, so we can achieve these temperature stages. We can go through that thermophilic stage, where hopefully we are sterilizing plant pathogens, weed seeds, vegetable seeds, if we're throwing the center of our pepper plant or cantaloupes and things like that. At that critical temperature stage of about 130 degrees, we should see a lot of these issues become sterile, become null and void in our composting system. Now, there are many things I would say, just keep it out of your compost pile. That would be any weeds that you're pulling, especially perennial type weeds like runners from Bermuda grass, weed seeds, because most of us are probably not going to be able to turn a pile, say, every 5 days, maintain that thermophilic stage long enough to truly neutralize weed seeds and maybe even some plant pathogens. So after we've achieved that thermophilic stage, 130, 160 degrees for about 2 weeks, we could, as long as we've turned it 5 times in that 2-week period, we could compost animal waste on farm, and then know that that should be safe and free of pathogens as well. So it is a good way for the backyard chicken person to more safely then utilize, again, just waste we're cleaning out of chicken houses or something like that. The other friend in our compost pile is an interesting character, the Acetomyces. So they are a type of bacteria, but they behave in long strands. They form in long strands, and so they kind of do more of the work of fungi. But they are the thing that give that fresh earthy smell like a freshly tilled field or a compost that is truly finished. Shouldn't have any original smells, shouldn't smell like ammonia or whatever may have been in there. It should have that nice fresh aroma like a tilled field or a truly finished compost. And that is what the streptomyces bring to the table. They also help bind these aggregates in the pile. Moist conditions, and you'll notice a truly finished compost is going to finish just a little bit below neutral. Depending on what we put in there, but even with maybe a more acidic carbon source like pine chips, pine straw, this composting process typically will produce a product that at the end result is somewhere in that 6 to 6.5 pH, which is really what most plants prefer to grow in. And these guys really only become active, assuming we had thermophilic stage, after that settling and curing process in a pile. Fungi, we're going to see all sorts of fungi, and they are important at the back end for that more long-term type carbon source, those lignin cellulose fibers that are going to be in wood chips, pine cones, things like that, that take more time and really aren't touched by the bacteria, but the fungi help to convert them into our finished compost. So most of these are mesophiles. And when I say mesophiles, that's that temperature stage where we're at, about ambient temperature outdoors. No more than, say, 10 degrees above outdoor air temperatures, so below 100 degrees. Thermophilic, if we build a pile, again, most of the time composting for this to happen, we have to have critical mass, we have to have all of these ingredients and enough moisture. We should see this 100-degree plus up to 160 degrees within hours, frankly, within hours, if not within, no more than 2 days. If we have not heated up within 2 days, then something in our calculation is probably off. After that work has been done, those bacteria have converted all of the free nitrogen. They've used it up to try to break down this material. We should enter into a mesophilic stage, which is below 104 degrees. We may not have a truly finished compost. We may just be in mesophilic. That stuff may be still fairly raw looking. It can probably be used as, say, a mulch around our plants. So at mesophilic stage, we should not have too much extra nutrients. We should not have a hot compost, which is where we would maybe want to be a little bit careful with using that around our plants, because we could see some burning because of the nutrient sources. To test a compost, again, once it's in that curing phase, depending on the time of year, should be no more than 10 degrees more than your ambient air temperature. And one of the best tools we have, and I get this question a lot because of all the horse farms up here, is the neighbors have stable waste. They swear they don't use Grazon. Can I use this in my garden? And I always encourage these folks to do what's considered this bioassay, which is put some of that material, your finished compost that you think is finished, the stable waste, etc. Maybe get a 1 gallon or a 3 gallon nursery pot, fill it half with that compost, maybe half with whatever the potting soil of the seedling came in, and plant a tomato. A tomato is one of the most sensitive plants to excessive nutrients, too high of salts, and residual herbicide. For certified compost, they have to do this bioassay, and they use watercress or tomato seeds. They will put them in the material. If they get better than 75% germination, then at that point, that compost is considered cured and stable, and able to be used. But I think it's a good thing for anyone who's thinking of using any form of manure to do this very simple test to ensure that we're not dealing with excessive salts, which can be there with urine and other things, but also with persistent herbicides that may be used in those hay fields and pastures where these animals are on. So to do that perfect ratio, actually horse manure by itself is kind of the perfect ingredient. It is typically 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen. You could almost just have that and do a very good job. You may have some smells. The lower we get in that range, 30-to-1, 25-to-1, you probably need to aerate that more. You need to make sure you're not getting a little bit too wet because it's probably going to have some stronger smells associated with it. On a larger scale, where I've got pictures here in a minute, they typically are going to manage those long windrows, probably more at a 40-to-1 or even 45-to-1. And that's as much about smells for neighborhoods and folks that are downwind of those large facilities. Moisture content, 45 to 60%, or for those of us in the backyard without fancy tools, if we touch it, does it feel like a wrung out sponge? Pretty good test. There are lots of apps. There's an app for everything. So you can get a compost formula app that's going to tell you proportions of the ingredients that you happen to have. But typically 2 or 3 parts carbon source, and that can be fall leaves, wood chips, hay, etc., to 1 of a green, which is your kitchen scraps, which is your manure, your grass clippings, things like that. You're probably going to start composting with 2 or 3 to 1 part green source. Here's some ratios. I can send this along just as a PDF, but these things can all range. Wood chips can vary, even fall leaves can vary depending on the tree species, how green they were when they fell, so on. But you notice that horse manure. Now that's horse manure by itself. That's not horse manure with all the bedding and things like that. If we're dealing with bedding, you're probably more at like a 45 or 50-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. So a good triage. The answer for composting problems is almost always aerate. You'll notice here. But I've seen a lot of failing composting systems. I was failing at composting until I found worms. And a lot of times it's drying out, or we've had a really wet period and then it's too wet. So if it's smelling bad, then we probably have a mixture that maybe just needs a little bit more of a carbon source. We need to aerate it to get it to dry out some, and we should be back in business. Stuff is not breaking down, then it's probably getting too dry. So getting some extra water on it. Again, it's still going to eventually break down. I think that's the nice thing about this. It's still going to break down. It's just going to take longer. And if we're seeing a lot of volunteers, random plants showing up, then we're doing more of just kind of an organic trash heap, a little bit here, a little bit there, and we're probably never having a critical mass and achieving that thermophilic stage where things are being neutralized. And that's probably common for most of us backyard composters. Commercial compost is quite different. It is done on a very large scale. So to put this picture here in perspective, this is over in Athens. The top of this windrow is almost at my eye level. So it's probably 5.5 to 6 feet tall from ground to the middle of this windrow. And this is easily 10 feet wide at the base. And this is mostly wood chips. And here they utilize resources. They get the wood chips for free, but this is a way for them to treat or dispose of their municipal biosolids or sewage. No smells. When I got to visit here, this was back in September of like 17 or 18, very hot. You would think that is the driest pile of compost you've ever seen. There's no way anything's going on. It looks like just mulch, really. But when they brought the turner through, specialized machine here is going through, and you can see this heat being released. Even on a hot day in September, 90 some degrees, look at all of that energy, steam coming off as if it was, a cool morning in springtime or fall. So there is a lot of biological activity, and that is still pretty dry. I mean, that is mostly dry. So for their system, they are turning that about every 5 to 7 days. They turn it 5 times to ensure that the outside gets to the middle and it breaks down as fast as possible. It then goes through a big trommel screen, and the bigger chunks, the drier stuff that doesn't make it through that screen, gets reincorporated back in that windrow and composted further in the next batch. So that's how it's made on a large scale. And in doing this job for 10 years, I've found that a lot of gardeners are buying this material and running into many plant problems, filling raised beds, sometimes entirely with that type of compost. And so we finally started testing some of that material. So this is nothing against where we sourced the material for these tests. One came from Mulchman, one came from Buck Jones. But if you could imagine trying to grow a vegetable garden in soils that one sample here was at a pH of 8.3, the other was at 7.7. So very, very high. Again, like I said, most of the time our compost, if it's finished, is likely going to finish at a pH of 6.5. So how is it getting this high in pH? I would believe that they are adding lime in the process, most likely to help mitigate smells. Again, these folks want to be good neighbors. They don't want to have that 10-acre facility upwind from a neighborhood. So I would think lime is being added both to mitigate smells. And then also, if you have at least North Georgia soil, or probably even statewide, you have an acidic parent soil. You have a soil that sometimes in our area, if new land is cleared, I am never surprised if a soil sample comes back where pines were cleared and a new property was developed, low 4s. So a material like this, if it's incorporated, again, used as an amendment, a couple inches tilled in down to 8 inches, we've probably done a pretty good job of buffering a very low pH soil, and probably done a decent job of adding a fair amount of nutrients. As you'll see, these things are quite high in nutrients, to the point of, if we're trying to grow young vegetable transplants or young seedling vegetables, we would run into toxicity issues. Phosphorus on that sample on the right, 1,100 pounds per acre. Potassium, 3,500 pounds per acre. Even magnesium, 1,400 pounds per acre. And not much difference. In fact, the potassium on the Mulchman sample was 6,700 pounds per acre. This is straight from the yard, straight from the pile, what our soils lab said these things had. So not exactly something you want to fill a raised bed with by itself. Imagine planting a gardenia or a blueberry in soil like this, a plant that prefers a pH of, low 5s. We're dealing with a pH here that's a factor of 3 higher. Yeah, sometimes about 3, at least 2.5. So every whole point we get out of range, it's a factor of 10. So we're close to 1,000 times out of the ideal range for something like an azalea or a blueberry, a more acid-loving plant with this material. So a lot of questions I like to ask folks in their backyard composting operations is, what are the goals and what time do you have to do this? If it's just we want to not throw away our kitchen waste, then nothing wrong with a lot of times out in the yard, I'll just throw it in where I have mulch anymore. What tools do we have? Because one of the challenges is the time of year that most of us have a lot of browns in the fall. We probably don't have a lot of greens to offset those browns. So something to consider is, again, this is ideally done at the right proportions to ensure that we're getting a better product or a product faster that we can then use. And if we're wanting material that we're eventually going to use, we probably need to get out there and turn it, once a week, once a month, all of those things. If the compost pile is far enough away from the house where it's out of sight, out of mind, again, we may be looking at more of just an organic trash heap. And there is, again, nothing wrong with that. That is perfectly fine. I got really into compost after I went to that training years ago. I had a few tumblers, but I was able to successfully do tumblers because I had a bagging mower. I've got about 2 acres of grass that I can bag. It's not preferred for the health of the grass. We want to, just sort of cut those clippings, leave them in place. But every now and then I could fill up the tumbler if I bagged half of the yard. But I was only able to do that because I also have an unlimited source of wood chips that my friends in the tree care business that live right down the street from me drop off at my house whenever I want it. So all of those things kind of fit for what I was able to do. Take away one of those things, and I would have never needed or wanted a tumbler. So simplest form could be just a heap, a pile. If you want to contain it somewhat, it will probably maintain that critical mass better than just piled up materials. Where some of these structures get to be a challenge is in that aeration. If we're trying to use a fork or the plug down that have wings pull up aerators, if we're snagging on the sides of that, concrete mesh wire type material, eventually you may just stop turning it and the material is not going to break down as fast and so forth. So that's one of the downsides of kind of the quick makeshift wire-based heap structure. Hoop would be the same thing. Easy enough to put together and can help, again, that critical mass be maintained. Some of the challenges are just then pulling that wire off, keeping it together, keeping your fork and everything else from snagging the sides. So turning can be a little bit of a challenge. We can use pallets quite easily if we can find them. Again, the goal is more just keeping it all in one place in a critical mass. We can even do this in, garbage cans if we really want, but that's probably not that practical. We would probably need to drill some air holes and things like that. I can think of a lot of other uses for a garbage can than composting. So these type structures, I've seen a lot of gardeners. My mom has had just about all of them. Anytime I'm doing this class and I ask for show of hands, how much compost do you ever get out of these? Usually the answer is none. It doesn't seem to ever become compost that we're then utilizing. So it's more of just an organic trash heap. That's fine. The goal here on some of these systems is the material goes in the top, and then it's got this little trap door where in theory we could scoop out some compost along the way and use it. These are fairly small. I don't know if they're necessary, but they can help if you live in a neighborhood where there are some kind of covenants and things like that. They may help to keep vermin and other critters out. But for most of us, we probably don't want to be trying to recycle or compost cooked food, bones, dairy, really even anything with salts. Front end of the cooking process, the peels, the skins, the cores, stuff like that is a better composting material. So just keep that in mind. These tumblers, they can work great. They can absolutely work great. If you ever want to know if you're going to get use out of something, look on Facebook Marketplace, look on what used to be Craigslist, and see how many of these things are being sold used. And you can probably deduce that there must be something off, or there must be something that I am missing. So for a while there, you could almost get these for free, these big ones here. These are quite expensive to buy new. And it takes a long time to fill one of these. This is almost an entire yard of material that it takes to fill this. So again, if you're just having once a week, you're dropping off kitchen scraps, you will honestly never fill this thing probably, and probably never really be getting compost out. They do make the turning process quite easy. So aeration, so that can speed it up, again, assuming we're starting with batch. Does do a good job of keeping pests out. And one of the most important things here is all of these other systems you will see are on the ground, on the ground, on the ground. Every compost bin that I have seen that touches the ground, if you are in any amount of sun exposure, this is habitat for fire ants. That is the last thing you want to be dealing with. If you are trying to turn that, trying to harvest that compost and then use it, is a massive mound, and they will make massive mounds in a compost pile because it's nice and warm in there and it's easy to excavate. Biggest challenge I've found with a lot of compost systems, school gardens. I don't know if schools should be using anything but these tumblers, again, more for that hazard of fire ants. So this does a decent job of keeping fire ants out. I don't know if it necessarily is worth the money otherwise, though. So I came home from that training. I found a few of these used. I think I got one for free, and I got one for 50 bucks, these tumblers here. And my bagging mower, again, another tool that I had in my tool bank, and the wood chips just feet away here behind my barn. So I would cut grass. This was in February. You can see the stuff in the background, no leaves on it. So this was cool temperatures, my wintertime weeds and some fescue being cut. It would go in the tumbler sometimes for as little as a week, and then it goes out here in the mesh bin to finish that mesophilic stage and curing phase. Those are my ingredients: the greens and the browns, fresh wood chips, and the grass clippings. I never added water because there was enough moisture in these grass clippings, 1 to maybe 2. Never had to add moisture, and that temperature increase started within 24 hours. I went back the next day, and I'm sure for it to show when I combine these materials on a Saturday, I was already at 150 degrees on Sunday around the same time. So the power of biology and microorganisms is remarkable. I was maintaining that 150 degrees, tumbling it once a day. Here it is, a few days later, and the following Saturday. This is still not a usable material. It probably could have stayed in the tumbler, but I refilled it with another batch. What I found is that I actually got hotter in that mesh bin. So I was pushing 165 in the mesh bin on the ground. And why is that? Is because there was just more oxygen available than there was in that tumbler. So you don't necessarily need the tumbler. Where it really helps is it makes that aeration, that rapid transition somewhat easier. It is a little bit of a pain to fill though, and then remove. So I don't know if it necessarily made anything better or added much value. The design flaw in these is you'll notice nice, good, solid plastic here on the outside. This is just sheet metal here. So all of my tumblers, thankfully I did not really buy them or at least spend much. All of them have rusted through. They no longer function. So that is the biggest design flaw with this type of compost tumbler. This is probably okay and could probably work much longer than some of these. So now we'll talk worms, because of all of these types of composting, when I started with worms, I had 0 kids. I now have 3. I have added more and more plants to our 2-acre landscape here, so I have my hands full. I have given up on the tumblers. I've given up on the bins and things like that. But I inherited worms in May. I think it was May of 2015, and I still have worms. So just about anybody I feel like could have success with composting with worms. This is where all of our kitchen scraps come. If I need compost on a large scale, I just go buy it from the local landscape yard. If I'm putting in a new landscape bed, or if I just need to kind of every 2-3 years just to add some more compost to my vegetable garden, I just go buy it. It's easier for me to do that, and I find that to be money well spent. So why does worm composting work? How does it work? We use the red wiggler, which is preferred over, say, our native earthworms or night crawlers, because the red wiggler is a top feeding worm in the horizon of a bin. And so that is where we would, every week or so, we're going to put material on top. That's where they are. But it's important to remember that all of that biology, at least the bacteria, is involved in a bin. The worms are not, using teeth and chewing up banana peels. They need it to already start converting and breaking down before they actually start consuming it. So, but I take my worms into schools. Kids absolutely love them. So if you have kids in your life, that could be a great, fun little project for them. It can be done indoors. I'm in my basement here. This is where they've always lived. And it could probably be done outside, although the ideal temperature that they thrive at is temperatures that we're most comfortable in. 65 to 90 degrees is where they are most efficient and happy. So this is what our worm looks like. Pretty simple organism. Important to remember is that they breathe through their skin. So growing up, my mom would garden, and she would always go collect worms in the gutters after it rained. And why are they there? Because the soil is so saturated, there is not enough air in contact with their skin. They have to evacuate and come to where there's going to be oxygen in contact with their skin. So where most people are failing with worm bins is they become too wet. The worms start to crawl out the sides, and it becomes a rancid, soupy mess. So moisture management, more from a habitat. We need to think about it more as the habitat of the worm. We're managing the bin for the habitat of the worm, and not as much about carbon to nitrogen and this and that. That's still important, but we're needing to keep moisture at, hopefully not to the point where we're getting leachate. A lot of these commercial products like worm factories and things like that, they'll have a tap down at the bottom for the leachate. And I'll show you my systems here in a minute. I designed my initial bin with a hole in the bottom for the leachate to go out through, and it was working. I was getting leachate, but what soon happened was then my bin became colonized by soldier fly larvae, which are an excellent composter. We could probably do a whole nother session on soldier fly larvae composting. But they prefer rotting organic matter that is on the wet side. So they were really an indicator that my bin was getting too wet. And eventually my worms, were not really functioning as well. I had that leachate hole down at the bottom. And so once I figured out I need to get this thing dry, I removed the carpet square covers that keep it dark and keep it from drying out, put a box fan on, came down in the basement the next day, and I literally had thousands of soldier fly larvae all over my basement floor here. So that was interesting and fun. But since I've done better about managing my moisture levels, I use shredded paper that I'm able to collect at our county building. I've never had soldier fly larvae in these bins again. So they breathe through their skin. They have a crop and gizzard, similar to if you guys are backyard chicken folk. So a little bit of aggregate is good. Most of us are probably cooking with eggshells. I will use eggshells after I've sort of put them in the microwave for just a minute to get them nice and brittle and dry. And then that stuff powderizes really well. That's the only aggregate that I will add. But if we're starting out fresh, you may want to use just a little bit of sand or maybe even just a little bit of native soil. That can help. So our red wiggler top feeding worm, they're going to eat, if everything is optimal, about half of their body weight per day. This is where we can do some fun math with those kids in our life. If we're going to buy worms, we're going to buy them in poundage or worm counts. So most typically 1,000 worms is about a pound of worm in weight. So we can do some math and figure out how much we can feed them realistically and expect them to break it down. So a bin will get too wet if we're overfeeding, they're not converting it, and we're not balancing the dry matter with shredded paper. Their population is going to double about every 3 months. So we're going to have more worms to feed that hopefully we can then, start adding in a little bit more of our kitchen scraps. And they actually make a cocoon. It's not an egg, but they make a cocoon where 2 to 4 little thread-like worms eventually emerge and grow and mature for up to about 2 years of a lifespan. And this is where we can go over. Hopefully you have good enough visuals on my webcam here. So this is what you will see. I have 3 bins still active. 1, 2, 3. The thing with composting, and this is outdoors, this is with worm bins, is I feel like practically we need at least 2 structures, sometimes even 3, because we have one that we're actively filling. And eventually we should probably stop filling it so it can finish. And then eventually we can then start using that compost. So both with worm bins, your bins outside, or maybe even your tumblers, is probably 2, if not 3 composting type systems. So we can have one again that we're hopefully able to start using this compost. If we're always adding more, we always have chunks that are not broken down. So you'll see here, carpet squares, found materials. I don't believe in spending money to get rid of trash. So these are just carpet squares. They help to keep this from drying out, and they also keep it dark. So the worms are going to be averse to light. So you can see we just put some material in here. I had a reporter come by on Friday. And so this was filled up. This was topped up with the shredded paper about that deep last Friday. You see my little friends here at the top. And this shredded paper was half of one of these bags. It was a lot of dry matter, and it's completely moist now. If you were able to
Hey, Josh.
have a touch-o-vision but this feels like a wrung out sponge. Yes, Brooklyn.
Can we
You guys
stop
getting a
the
decent
screen
view?
share so that we can see you in a larger
Oh,
frame?
yeah. Yeah, I didn't think of that. Let's see here. Stop share. There we go. Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay. So, like I was showing, thick layer, we can kind of see this is multiple inches of fresh shredded paper went on after I put my kitchen scraps, my coffee grounds, all the stuff that likely would have, maybe drawn flies if it was at the top. So this is as much about moisture management as it is also about smothering that fresher stuff that's going to smell like compost and maybe draw fruit flies and other things down in here. But if we were to dig around, and there's a lot more worms than what we see because they're down here in this material. And there's some maybe fruit flies right there. And every now and then when I do feed, I'll maybe mix this through a little bit more because the material that is mostly broken down is down here at the bottom. And we can see it's a little more finished and it's a lot wetter. You can almost hear the squishy, the moisture down there. So every now and then I'll kind of come around and just incorporate more of that dry matter deeper in here. But a bin that's failing, we would have seen worms crawling up the side, trying to get to oxygen. So, but everything in this bin is looking pretty good. This has reached the top. I will probably cease putting more material in here, so this can just start becoming more of a finished compost. That can take up to maybe 4 months in the way that I manage. Some of this can be sped up if we manage differently. The way that I can manage with everything else, once I fill it up, I've probably got 4 months before I realistically start that harvesting process. And harvesting for me, if this was finished, and maybe one of these other bins is finished down here, closer to, look at all those roly-polies in there. So this one is looking a little bit more finished. Maybe this is my next one that I try to harvest. You can see it's almost done here. When I'm ready to transition this thing over, what I have found is easiest for me. Again, it's all about being easy in my life with everything is I will leave those carpet squares off and it will begin to dry because I want to get the good compost and I want to keep my workforce, the worms, in the bins. I don't want to spread those guys around in my landscape because they're useful over here. So I have found what works is this nice little screen. I can measure off these squares, but it's a pretty fine screen. This is actually a screen that we would use for cleaning seed. So fairly small, but it's small enough to where my worms cannot pass through. But if my compost is dry enough, which it's not now, if it's dry enough, I can sift and get a nice, really fine compost through here. My bigger chunks and my worms stay up here and they can go right back into a bin that I'm either starting or is still active and do things that way. So that is what I have found works. There's another way to harvest. If we don't want to spend anything, we can just dump out a bin on a well-lit area like this basement or on the driveway. The worms are going to be averse to the light. They will go to the center of the pile and we can just kind of with our hand scoop off the outer layer. It will be free of worms. I found that just letting it dry, kind of this much at a time, and it takes a good week for it to dry that deep in that bin. Then I can come do a few shakes, sift off that dry layer, go on with the rest of my day. And so again, this has worked for going on 9 years, 9.5 years with everything else. I'm still doing it. So they're a pet, they're a way to compost. That is as easy as it gets. I can just leave these things alone probably for 2 months. They will still be fine. With the amount of material that's in there, they're not going to dry out. They're not going to run out of stuff to eat. So I can go on vacation and things like that. I can't say that about many other things in my life that I can just not pay attention to for 2 months, and they're going to be fine. So this has worked up to this point. A couple of issues along the way is shredded paper. Again, I work in a place where we have nice shredders. There is bad shredded paper in my view. So you notice this nice surface area material that's cut into small bits. That works very well. It breaks down quickly. I ran short of this material at one point years ago, and I got shredded paper from our library, and it was in long strands. That was a terrible material to deal with. I tried to even put it through my tumblers, and it didn't even do a good job out there because it just made big wads, and it didn't become well integrated with the nitrogen source. It didn't break down. It just made these big gross clumps. So a good crosscut shredded paper is ideal. This is just office paper. I'd probably want to avoid glossies, things like that. We can use cardboard boxes. In fact, the worms, it's good habitat. Again, this is about making good habitat for the worms. So those corrugations they find is pretty good habitat. They'll hang out in there. They'll come back in and out of the compost bin. So we can just go kind of straight strips of brown corrugated cardboard. Newspaper is fine as well. The smaller the surface area, the better. And that's the same outdoors as it is in a worm bin. It's going to break down faster. So even my banana peels, I try to cut up in a few pieces and not just long strands. It's just going to make it break down that much faster. So when I got started in worms, I heard from others about, how great worm compost was. 10 times this nutrient, this. And I thought, well, let's test this material because these are pretty fantastical claims. I'll go back to sharing my screen and I'll show you guys what some of my lab results came back with. So let's see here. These are just experiments. 0%, 10%, 20% castings in a growing media. Growth differences. Carrots, same thing. And these are from our lab. I sent my worm castings and bagged mushroom compost that you'd buy at the big box store. So the kind of yellow putrid line here is my worm castings. So I'm like 12 times the calcium, 7-8 times the potassium. Still not necessarily high compared to, say, 1010, but definitely more in line with a lot of truly, organic fertilizers, which are going to be like 3-4-3 or something like that. You can see I'm at almost 2% nitrogen, 1.5% potassium. So again, not exactly fertilizer in terms of volume by weight, percentages, but definitely better than, that bagged mushroom compost. This is nothing against mushroom compost. That's a good material. It's the nature of how mushroom compost is developed. That's mostly on higher carbon material, and that fungi is consuming, right, and colonizing, and what's left, there's not much left because there really wasn't much there to begin with in straw or wood chips or things like that. So kind of fun to see the differences and the results. This is a quick video. Let me get to the back here because I think the benefit, like I talked about earlier, is the biological benefit of compost, but also in worm compost. So they did, Cornell Waste Management put this short video together where they use vermicomposting in nursery production and found great pathogen resistance for some seedling diseases. So I'll let this play. Oops, maybe here we go. Gosh darn it, why can I not figure this out? real quick. It's short. Oops. All right. So that's the fun side of compost. Vermicompost is again, it's not as much about the nutrients. As you saw, the sterilized compost would have still had those nutrients, but you didn't get that pathogen protection there. So here I am 9.5 years in, and I've still managed to keep it up, compost, because it doesn't really require that much of me in my time. So I would hope or think that a lot of you out there could probably design your own system, assuming you can find just a few of these resources like scrap wood, a food grade barrel. I think it's a good idea to maybe start not quite in 25-gallon increments here, because one of the challenges with a bin that's too large is that critical mass. If you're starting to deal with moisture issues, it is a lot more challenging to correct. It takes a lot more shredded paper. So I tell, our school teachers that are thinking of doing this in their classroom, or even hobbyists that want to try, is maybe start with much smaller containers and figure out how worms live, what management they need, get good at it. You can then also kind of grow your colony, and then just have multiple smaller bins. This is probably too small, but I wouldn't want to go quite 25 gallons right out the gate. I would start with, something that was maybe, I don't know what size these Rubbermaids come in. I think they're measured in liters sometimes, but like a 10 or 20 liter type plastic shoebox type thing, and get good at it that way first. And then, if you want to expand up to bigger sizes, it's just correcting problems in a big bin just takes a lot more. And you may not notice that they're starting to become issues until it's really an issue, like I had with mine initially. So, Brooklyn, are there some questions? I see some of the chat.
Yes, thank you so much.